October 1907, Central Ohio. A limestone quarry outside a town small enough to disappear in winter fog. Before dawn, 3 men from a survey crew walked down a timbered shaft with carbide lamps, measuring rods, and a canvas satchel full of tags for cataloging whatever they found below. By noon, only 1 lamp came back up. That is the version people remembered. The official record was colder than memory. Delayed blasting, water intrusion, structural instability, work suspended, men presumed lost in a collapse zone that could not be safely reopened. It reads like a routine industrial tragedy, a sad one, but a simple one. That is how these stories are sealed, not with certainty, with paperwork. But there was one detail that did not fit. The order to flood the lower shaft was signed before the missing men were formally listed as missing, not after, before. And this is where it starts to turn. Because if the shaft was flooded as a safety response, why were wagons seen arriving that same evening from the county seat? Why did the foreman later tell his wife that no blast had gone wrong at all? And why, in an inventory book recovered years later from an estate sale, were measurements written in red pencil that had nothing to do with stone, ore, or timber supports, but everything to do with a body? Length, 8 feet 9 inches. Shoulder width, unusually broad. Cranium, intact. For decades, people treated the story like Quarry folklore. Men vanish underground, strange lights in the cut, drunken workers exaggerate what they saw. The official version always wins in the end because it has stamps, signatures, and shelves to sit on. But around that quarry, the shelves were never full. Pages vanished, ledger numbers skipped. A map of the lower galleries survived, with 1 square of paper cut neatly out of the center, as if someone removed not a mistake, but a location. So let's begin where they wanted it buried. Not with giants, not with legends, not with the kind of claim that makes people stop listening. We begin with a shaft, a survey crew, a flooded chamber, and a sequence of decisions that makes no sense if the men were simply lost in rubble. Why pump water into a place before a rescue? Why post armed deputies at a quarry entrance that same evening? Why were local doctors summoned if there were no survivors? And why, according to one widow's private testimony, did her husband come home 2 nights earlier than the papers claimed, trembling so badly he could not hold a spoon? He told her he had seen a room under the quarry. Not a cavity, not a cave, a room. He said the walls were too straight, the floor was too level, and something inside it had been laid out before the stone came down over it, before the water, before the official record, before the missing pages, before the story was covered and covered again. If he was lying, then the lie spread strangely far. If he was telling the truth, then the story did not end with 3 missing surveyors. It began with what they found down there.
The ordinary witness in most buried history stories is never ordinary for long. In this case, it was a man named Edwin Vale, 32 years old, assistant chainman, hired for survey work because he could read angles, draw clean lines, and keep his mouth shut. Payroll sheets place him at the quarry that autumn. His name appears 3 times in surviving company records. Then it stops. His widow, Nora, spoke only once in any detail, not to a newspaper, not to a court, to her sister in a letter folded inside a family Bible and found decades later after a farmhouse auction. The letter is not dramatic. That is what makes it feel dangerous. She does not accuse anyone. She does not rant. She writes like a woman trying to understand why the man she knew came back from work looking like someone who had already been buried. She says Edwin would wake at night, choking. She says he kept washing limestone dust from his hands even when there was none there. She says he burned 2 sketches in the stove and then sat in silence for nearly an hour, watching the paper curl black. When she asked what he had drawn, he answered, "The arch and the face." Then he refused to say more. The official version claimed the survey crew descended to assess a crack line before blasting. Vale told Nora that was only half true. They were sent down after laborers reported hitting worked stone beneath a seam that should have been solid. One of the laborers had broken through first with a pry bar. Behind the rockfall, he said, was open space and air so cold it felt wrong for the depth. Already, the case is opening another locked door. Worked stone means intention. Intention means hands, and hands means whoever made that chamber was there long before the Quarry Company, long before the county map, long before the official record began pretending the ground was simple. According to Nora's letter, Edwin said the crew squeezed through a break in the wall and entered a chamber supported by massive squared blocks darkened with mineral sheen. He noticed grooves cut into the floor, shallow and straight, running toward a raised platform at the far end. One of the surveyors joked that it looked like some old underground chapel. No one laughed for long. Because on the platform was what Edwin first took for a collapsed pillar wrapped in clay. Then someone raised a lamp. What they found, in his telling, was not a statue and not a pile of stone. It was a body, or the remains of one, laid out on its back, with the head slightly turned and the jaw still closed. The proportions were wrong at a glance, not distorted, not monstrous, just larger in a way that made every ordinary object around it seem reduced. A boot print near the platform, he said, looked childish beside the exposed foot bones. And this is where it gets darker. Edwin told Nora the oldest man in the crew, a surveyor named Harlan Pike, did not react with surprise. He reacted with recognition. He stepped forward, stared at the platform, and said, "So that is why the lower streets never matched the church hill." It is a strange sentence, strange enough to matter, because it suggests this was not an isolated curiosity at the bottom of a quarry. It suggests somebody had already noticed that the landscape above did not belong cleanly to the foundations below. Buried layers, mismatched grades, streets too high for their oldest doors, basements that were once ground floors. What if the chamber under the quarry was not a freak anomaly, but one surviving pocket of a deeper, older level? Edwin never finished the story in one sitting. Nora says he could only say it in pieces, as if even speaking of that chamber came with a cost. But one thing he repeated again and again was this: the body was not alone. There were niches in the wall, and some of them were empty.
Once you hear that, the case changes shape. A single giant skeleton can be dismissed as fraud, misidentification, frontier myth, a drunk man's tale made larger with every retelling. But a prepared chamber, worked stone, empty wall niches, floor grooves, and a surveyor who seemed to know something was wrong with the ground before anyone else stepped below. That is not one mystery, that is a pattern trying not to be seen. The story did not end there. It deepened through records that were never meant to sit side by side. Years after the flooding, a local schoolmaster named Elias Mercer began collecting county oddities, clipped articles, copied deeds, discarded payroll notes, survey scraps bought by the bundle when offices cleared shelves. Among those papers was a damaged field log with entries for the Quarry Week in October 1907. Most pages were ordinary: weather, depth estimates, crew names, tool counts, but in the middle were 2 leaves torn cleanly, followed by a note in a different hand. Lower void extends east beyond known cut. Sounding returned hollow at 14 feet. Further work subject to county review. County review.
Why would a private quarry discovery trigger county review unless the opening connected to something larger than a workplace hazard? And why, on the very next surviving page, does the handwriting change again, colder this time, more compressed as if written under instruction? Access restricted pending stabilization, no public mention, remove secondary copies. Remove secondary copies. That phrase hangs over the whole case like damp air in a sealed room. Mercer found more, a receipt for oilcloth and rope purchased not by the quarry company but by the sheriff's office, a carriage ledger placing 2 deputies and 1 physician at the site after sundown, and a doctor's memorandum, unsigned, describing osseous remains of extraordinary scale, with a warning that exposure to air had caused flaking on cranial and costal surfaces. Those are not the words of men dealing with a routine collapse. Those are the words of people trying to manage an inconvenient discovery without naming it. Still, one possibility remained. If true, perhaps the chamber held ceremonial burials from some unknown local tradition, later misread by frightened workers. That would be the safer explanation, the more plausible one. But the official explanation does not fully answer this. If it was just an archaeological find, why flood it? Water preserves and destroys. It conceals quickly. It turns a location into an argument. Once a chamber is flooded, every future witness becomes uncertain. Memory softens. Maps become rumors. The shaft becomes too dangerous. The site becomes too expensive. The evidence field dissolves into mud. And yet, one more witness remained. A driller named Samuel Roque told his pastor years later that the crew had been ordered not to touch the second one, not the remains, the second one. He claimed there was another platform deeper in the chamber, under a low stone arch, and that something on it was covered in thick mineral crust, as if it had lain there far longer. When Roque asked why they were stopping, Pike answered with a line that should trouble anyone listening. Because if this chamber continues under the hill, the town was built over something no one will want measured. Built over. Built over what? Graves? Foundations? A buried level? A forgotten structure large enough to distort the later map? Suddenly, the flooded shaft no longer looks like the end of a workplace tragedy. It looks like a sealed entrance into a landscape hidden beneath the one people thought they knew. And the more you look, the more Ohio begins to whisper the same pattern. Old courthouses with windows under the sidewalk, brick facades whose first floors sit too deep, church basements with exterior stonework worn as if by weather, not by cellar damp. Official records call these quirks of settling, grading, redevelopment. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes the official version begins to sound less like an answer and more like a blanket thrown over too many shapes. What if the quarry shaft mattered because it connected the bones to the buried architecture? What if what they found down there was not only a body, but proof that an older world had been covered, then mapped over, then explained away, one office at a time?
By now, the easy response is obvious. Stories like this attract embellishment. Missing pages become legends because people want a villain. Flooded chambers become proof of suppression because mystery is more seductive than erosion, paperwork errors, or fear. That is fair. It should be said. And yet, skepticism cuts both ways. Because skepticism also applies to the official record. The official version says 3 men vanished in a collapse, but one of those men, Edwin Vale, came home. His wife wrote it, his behavior changed, his sketches were burned. If the record failed there, where else did it fail? The official version says the shaft was flooded for safety, yet invoices show unusual overnight transport, additional guards, and county involvement before the public notice. The official version says no human remains were recovered, yet the doctor's memorandum speaks in the language of anatomical examination. Every step of the safe explanation leaves something unaccounted for.
And this is where the story stops being local, because the Quarry case begins to resemble dozens of buried past anomalies that never quite line up in public but align disturbingly well in private notes. Lower street levels hidden beneath modern grade, sealed tunnels under civic buildings, archive catalogs with gaps where excavation reports should be, estates selling off maps with corners missing, family testimony about finds that were taken for study and never returned. A single event can be coincidence, a pattern is harder to flood. Some researchers argue that the giant stories are late inventions layered over older burial discoveries. Others say the size descriptions were exaggerated by reporters who wanted sensation. One possibility is that both things happened and still do not explain the chamber, because the body alone is not the strongest part of this case. The strongest part is the setting. A prepared stone room beneath a quarry, niches in the wall, a raised platform, straight floor grooves, hidden continuity with the built environment above. That is architecture, not accident. Which raises the larger, more dangerous question. If true, who covered it? Nature, time, catastrophe, or people who came later and reused what they found? Think about how histories are usually buried, not in one dramatic act, in layers. A flood deposits silt, a fire clears a district, new streets rise, rubble is compacted, basements become first floors, cellars become tunnels, old doors open into dirt. A generation passes, then another. Soon the buried layer is no longer a memory, it is an inconvenience to engineering, a curiosity to archivists, a rumor to everyone else. But in the Ohio case, the covering does not feel entirely natural. Too many decisions happen too quickly. Too much administrative pressure appears too early. Too many records are removed from the archive just when measurement should have begun. That is not geology. That is management. And people pay for management with silence. Nora Vale wrote that Edwin stopped attending church socials, stopped sitting by the front window, stopped speaking to neighbors who asked about the quarry. She says his hands shook when wagons passed at night. She says that once, after waking from a nightmare, he said they flooded the wrong side first. She did not know what he meant, neither do we, but the line lingers because it implies sequence, plan, deliberation. They did not panic, they chose. Some hidden history stories collapse because they rely on one impossible object and nothing around it feels real. This one is harder to dismiss because the human details refuse to behave like fantasy. Burned sketches, a widow's careful letter, torn field log pages, a physician summoned without public reason, deputies guarding a private quarry, a chamber that should not have been there. The body, if true, is the spectacle, but the behavior around it is the evidence feel. The story did not end there. It widened into a possibility no county office could comfortably file. What if the buried giant was not a mythic exception, but a remnant of whoever occupied the lower world before the map above was finalized?
Imagine standing at the rim of that quarry after the flooding. The pumps have stopped. The men at the gate say work is suspended. The official record is already hardening into language that will outlive every witness. Below you, somewhere under black water and broken limestone, lies a chamber no one is supposed to measure again. Maybe one body, maybe more than one, maybe an entire corridor running east under the hill, beneath streets whose elevation never quite made sense. That is the scale of the implication. Because if the chamber continued, then this is no longer only a giant bones story. It becomes a buried city story. Hidden lower architecture, sealed foundations, lost urban layers lying under the official town, as if the present was poured over an unfinished exhumation. And if that sounds extreme, remember the quieter details first. Windows below sidewalks, buried thresholds, foundation walls too weathered for cellars, maps that show one grade while surviving brickwork suggests another. The body is what people argue about. The lower world is what they avoid. One possibility is that the chamber belonged to an older ceremonial complex, long forgotten and later entombed by shifts in terrain. Another is more unsettling.
that the lower level remained partially known into the modern period, but was treated as unstable, embarrassing, or politically inconvenient. If true, then the official version was never designed to explain what happened. It was designed to close the site. And this is where it gets darker. Because the missing survey crew may not have all vanished in the way the papers claimed. The absence itself becomes suspect. Harlan Pike disappears from the record after the incident. Not a death notice, not a pension file, just absence. One laborer transfers counties within weeks. Another reportedly refused to enter any shaft again. If the chamber held only old bones, why did living men behave like they had seen something that rearranged their understanding of the world above them? Maybe it was scale. Maybe it was preservation. Maybe it was the realization that the official timeline for the region had no room for what lay below. A giant burial chamber under a quarry is strange. A giant burial chamber connected to buried architecture beneath a functioning town is civilizational. And once that door opens, every removed document matters more. Why were secondary copies ordered removed from the archive? Why was the lower map cut? Why did the physician remain unsigned? Why does the sheriff's office purchase restraint canvas on the same date? A detail so odd it almost sounds invented until you remember how institutions behave when evidence threatens a stable narrative. They move quickly, they compartmentalize, and they describe no more than they must. What mattered to them may not have been proving giants. It may have been preventing linkage. Bone to chamber, chamber to tunnel, tunnel to buried street to older foundation to a history no one was prepared to reopen. This is what makes the Ohio case linger in the mind long after the names fade. Not because it offers perfect proof. It does not. It offers something more psychologically dangerous. It offers structure, a chain of contradictions strong enough to suggest that the buried past was not merely lost, it was managed. And management has a cost. Nora outlived Edwin by nearly 20 years, according to family notes. In all that time, she never destroyed the letter. She hid it, folded it, kept it where only kin would find it after she was gone. That is the behavior of someone who feared ridicule and feared silence even more. Someone who knew the official record would survive unless one thin human voice did too. So ask yourself, what kind of discovery leaves that mark? What kind of chamber changes a man's sleep, empties the archive, floods a shaft, and still cannot stay fully buried?
Maybe we will never know exactly what the chamber held. Maybe the water took the last clean answers with it. Maybe the missing pages are gone for good. Maybe the bones, if they were bones, were boxed, mislabeled, studied in private, or reduced to fragments no later catalog could identify without context. That happens more often than people want to admit. Not every vanished record is part of a grand design. Sometimes history disappears through fear, convenience, and the simple power of men in offices deciding what is worth keeping. But sometimes the official version becomes too neat, and the Ohio Quarry story is too neat on the surface and too damaged underneath. That tension is what keeps it alive. A flooded shaft, a survey crew sent below after worked stone was struck, a chamber with straight walls and prepared niches, a body measured in red pencil, deputies, a doctor, missing leaves from a field log, orders to remove secondary copies, and a witness who came home altered, as if part of him never truly climbed back out. That is not proof in the legal sense. It is something older and more haunting than that. It is testimony pressing against erasure.
If the account is true, then what they found was not just a giant, it was a fragment of a buried timeline, a clue that parts of the landscape we inherit are built over older levels we no longer recognize, and that some of those levels may contain remains, structures, and histories too disruptive for the official record to welcome. If the account is not fully true, what matters is the pattern: flooded access, sealed lower spaces, vanished records, human fear, human silence. The same shapes appear again and again, from quarry cuts to city basements to forgotten foundations under streets that feel older than their names. And maybe that is the real buried giant in this story, not the body on the platform, the scale of what might still be hidden below our feet. Because once you start noticing buried windows, lowered doors, missing plans, and archives with clean little gaps where the wrong report should be, the world above stops looking complete. It starts looking layered, covered, sealed, built over, as if the ground itself has been edited. The story did not end in 1907. It continues every time an old shaft is filled without survey, every time a lower level is called irrelevant, every time the official record closes faster than the evidence can breathe. Somewhere under Ohio limestone and black water, a chamber may still wait in the dark, holding whatever the first crew saw when their lamps found the platform and the room answered back with silence. And if that silence was bought, then someone believed it was worth the price. If you've been following these buried cases with me, you already know this is never just about one quarry, one witness, or one vanished file. It is about the pattern beneath the pattern, the places where the story breaks, the pages go missing, and the ground refuses to match the map. Stay close to that instinct. It usually leads somewhere the official version does not want to go. Because the deeper you look into hidden history, the less it feels buried by time alone, and the more it feels buried on purpose.